It was a great pleasure for me to receive all these 14 articles and go through them to see all the experiences, reflections, the wisdom and the provocation contained in these articles. They are all prepared in response to a number of questions that were sent out to participants, where they were asked to reflect beforehand on issues on confronting extremism. Do you experience extremism in your local national context? How can people engage in interfaith dialogue, play a positive role? And so on and so forth. You have all seen these questions, and I'll not waste time repeating them. I will not go through each and every article. Instead, I will reflect on these articles under three headings. The first heading is, what is extremism? The second one, what are the causes of extremism? And thirdly, how may we contribute to the countering of extremism? And in all three areas, I'll look at the relationship with religion. The words, as we have heard, are many. Fanaticism, radicalization, terrorism, extremism. But what do we actually mean with these and similar terms? At this conference, we are focusing on one of the words, extremism. Reverend Peter Götz stated in his paper that it is difficult to define religion, but it is even much more difficult to define extremism. Why at all waste time on defining what we mean by extremism? Well, we heard yesterday that the definition of a problem is half the solution of the problem. So therefore, we have to know exactly what we are talking about, otherwise we may be wasting our time when discussing. Dr. Birgitte Schepelern Johansen states that sometimes extremism is taken to mean the use of anti-democratic, typically violent means to further a certain political agenda. At other times it is used to designate the adherence to intolerant and absolutist ideologies. And again, at other times it is used to label whatever ideas, organizations or practices that are considered too far away from the norm or the mainstream. The last definition shows the importance of how we use the word extremism. As she says, in another case, fighting extremism can be a dangerous cover-up for silencing protests and rebellions against the established political system. In some of the papers, it is stated what all of us here know, that extremism is not only linked to Islam, it is not only linked to other religions and all religions, but it is linked to many other phenomena. It is a more universal phenomenon that is also linked to political ideologies, nationalist ideologies, and so on and so forth. Dr. Al-Kasnavi states that, in fact, any belief or ideology, when it turns into a group or a system, carries the seeds of extremism that would grow bigger and bigger whenever this ideology or belief is based on exclusion and annihilation, and hence is easily transformed into a racist, sanguinary movement. Subsequently, fanaticism is at the root of extremism, which in turn is inherent in any belief, including religious beliefs, since each religion claims to be the sole key to redemption. Extremism, as simply defined, is culmination, the ultimate level that could ever be reached, and hence it goes together with a believer's faith that has attained its peak. But what are the causes of extremism? In his paper, Dr. Jørgen Nielsen notes that it is unfortunate that both politicians and the media gravitate towards single cause explanations. Complex situations like the history and context of Islamic State do not easily submit to a single cause explanation, but of course, Once complex explanations are put on the table, finding an appropriate response becomes difficult. And the more complex the causes, the more difficult it is to find a way forward. That is exactly what we've been listening to yesterday, that there are multiple causes of extremism. And Judge Abu Zaid reminds us that extremism is not just one phenomenon with the same causes all over the world. We have to look at the specific geographical and cultural context in which extremism appears. And he goes on to define categories of causes for extremism. There are causes linked to states and governments, including injustice, oppression, corruption. There are causes related to groups that resort to violence, and that may have to do with lack of education or ignorance, and also with problematic interpretation of texts. And there are causes related to individual things like psychological readiness for violence and a feeling of a sense of injustice or oppression. A number of papers point to the effects of wars, as we have just been talking about, invasions and conflicts, when looking for the causes of extremism. Dr. Johannes Nielsen explicitly points to the problem of failed states. I quote, "It is no coincidence that the origins of Islamic extremism are to be found in what are essentially failed states, Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, Libya, Syria. In this context, the reasons for their failure, foreign invasion, collapse of dictatorship, drought, are less important than the fact of failure, which creates a political and social power vacuum partnered with economic collapse. Basically, what we have here is a failure of governance." There's also another aspect of the causes of extremism found here in Europe. It has to do with failed integration of immigrants in Western countries. Dr. Yusuf Al-Hassan writes that unfortunately the Islamic component in Europe is more and more associated with the European social crisis, which is aggravated today by the new refugee problem, as well as by violent extremism. And we, he says, are mainly concerned by the capacity of the European public sphere to create strong integration ties. Along the same line, Dr. Hassan, that we had better look for the reasons behind their failure to integrate Muslim migrants in their societies and acknowledge their responsibility in creating feelings of exclusion and hatred among the second generation of migrants, instead of calling for their eviction or return to countries where they can offload their violence and frustration. We are together here as most of us representatives of churches and mosques and Christian Muslim organizations, and therefore we should of course particularly look at the relationship between religion and extremism. What role does religion play concerning the development of extremism? First of all, Dr. Hassan stresses that all religions have a potential for extremism. Extremism is not only found in Muslim societies. In fact, Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, and Buddhism were all marked at some point of their history with examples of fierce extremist and violent fundamentalism generated by the emergence of extremist groups that justified their exactions with ideological misinterpretations. And Reverend Peter Goetz, from a Christian point of view, agrees with this. He thinks that most religions carry a seed of fanaticism and extremism. And then he goes on to say, now the postulate that religion is used as a tool for extremism needs a correction. It is when a certain group of people interpret their religion in a certain way that they make religion as a tool. It is not the religion as such, but the way somebody use and especially misuse their religion. Religions as such are not agents that develop extremism. Human beings are agents, and in their agency they may use their religion. Religious texts can, as Dr. Kasnavi says, be interpreted, reinterpreted, and counter-interpreted. In fact, almost all religious movements throughout history, whether extremist or moderate, have used religious texts for their own benefits. They have interpreted them in a way that seems to benefit their own goals. And he goes on to refer to the history of Islam. That is the reason why Imam Ali avoided arguing the Holy Quran with the Kharijite, since it was easily interpretable, as he used to say. There are texts in the Quran, as well as in the Bible, and in other sacred texts that have been used and that have been interpreted in such a way that they could be used to legitimate extremism. In his book, Laying Down the Sword, from 2011, Philip Jenkins shows how both the Quran and the Bible contain texts that have been used in the history of these religions to support violence and war, and how Christians and Muslims, based on these texts, have committed terrible actions of violence and terror with reference to justification to passages in their own scripture. But, and this is critically important, to say that terrorists or extremists can find religious texts to justify their acts does not mean that their violence actually grows from these scriptural roots. Religious texts do not have agendas. They are not agents. But religious people who interpret these texts, they do have agendas, and they are agents, and they are the ones responsible for their interpretations and for the actions based on these interpretations. Other papers put question marks on the relationship between religion and extremism. Professor Father George Masu is of the opinion that where extremism prevails, God is absent. God becomes a tribal God. He is no longer the Lord of the worlds. He is a totem which protects and shields a tribe from members of other tribes. God becomes a trademark for a specific group. So, in his opinion, which is reflected also by others, if you really have an extremist version of religion, the question is if it has anything to do with the true religion. Others have said that extremism represents a malfunction of religions. It can happen in different ways. Somebody said, is extremism a symptom of a crisis of the contemporary religious discourse characterized by ignorance and lack of religious thinking? So, since people are not well trained in their religion, they deviate from a sound teaching. If it is not ignorance that is a problem, it could be confusion. Religious extremism starts when its members confuse between what is essential, as somebody said, related to the essence of religion, and what is ephemeral. Again, a question of interpretation. And Asma Kaftaru says that her grandfather, in his description of extremists, says that the Prophet always said that they were people who overexerted themselves in prayers and devoutness, who superficially interpreted religious texts without really getting their essence, which mainly calls for love and tolerance. Again, Director Kaftaru, in her historical analysis, indicates that extremism in Islam occurs under certain social and political circumstances. Throughout the history of Islam, the most flagrant examples of extremism was that of the Kharijite, dating back to 36 after the Hijrah. These manifestations rose and faded at several phases of history. They emerged whenever the political system was oppressive and grew fainter when justice prevailed. Then, finally, what are the solutions to the problem of extremism? How can we counter extremism? Let's start on our own turf with the religious and theological issues. And one issue that is pointed out by a number of papers is the question of how do we interpret sacred texts. Again, Asma Kaftaru refers to her grandfather, the late Sheikh Ahmed Kaftaru, who never attempted to disregard any texts from the Quran or the Hadith that called for jihad or violence, but he clearly highlighted the difference between verses of war and those of peace, clarifying that what was said about violence was addressed to fighters in war zones, adding that war is an exception and can only be necessary when it aims at defending the nation, that people should avoid it and eliminate its effects, always reminding what came in the Quran: fight in the way of Allah those who fight you, but do not transgress. Indeed, Allah does not like transgressors. This is one way of a guideline for interpretation. Another way along the same issue here, and along the line of Philip Jenkins' position in the book Laying Down the Sword, would be for adherents of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam to come together and, instead of pointing accusing fingers at each other or carrying out a divine beauty contest, as he says, then enter into an honest dialogue where we together explore and share our histories of religion and violence, and explore how violent texts in Islam, in Christianity, in Judaism have been dealt with through the histories of interpretation in the various religions. We have to show to ourselves and to each other and to the world that our religions have the resources to deal effectively with the violent extremism that extremists try to justify by reference to certain apparently violent texts in the Holy Scripture. Secondly, there is the issue of education, and this has been raised many times, and a specific aspect of that is the education of imams here in Denmark. Bishop Peter Fischer-Møller refers to a discussion he had in Lebanon with the leader, Muslim leader, who said, it is a major problem for the Muslims in Denmark and the Danish society if you have uneducated imams not able to speak the language and not familiar with the culture. It is dangerous. If Islam or any religion is not interpreted and preached into the local culture, it can be misused to create parallel societies and breed extremism. There's also the issue of the social media. Dr. Al-Baidadi says that we have seen how social media have been used by terrorist organizations such as Islamic State and others to spread their vicious ideas among the youth and to recruit young fighters from all over the world. And if the social media are part of the problem, they should also be made part of the solution. He says we need to fight these groups with the same weapon, using social media and technology to spread peace values and human principles. We have to use living examples of people who can have a positive influence over others. The main problem is that adolescents and youngsters hardly find positive role models, hero stories against extremism. A fourth way of addressing or countering extremism is about dialogue and praxis. And not surprisingly, many point to the role of dialogue in countering extremism. All religions contain resources that should be activated in countering extremism. Reverend Birte Jacobsen writes that we have to ask why we should be enemies because of our religion. We are human beings, all of us. We live in the same society. We know what is good and what is not good. We know what destroys life. Dialogue could begin talking about what in our religion teaches us to meet each other with respect, to show hospitality, to make aid programs for each other, to respect freedom for minorities in our societies. We could tell each other stories from our scripture, from the Quran and the Bible, and we could tell each other stories about how we experience life together. And Dr. Al-Baghdadi adds to that the dimension of dire praxis when he voices his experience that living and working together in a team of Muslims and Christians could break the barriers of stereotypes. And he says that this experience that he had left a positive impact and changed not only the workers' mindset, but that of their families and communities as well. But as Asma Kaftaru points out with reference to her grandfather, Sheikh Kaftaru, who said that facing extremism involves more than dialogue. It entails an integrated social action. We need to break the chains of violence by building successful societies where each and every component has a role to play in providing the right education, ensuring social justice, job opportunities, as well as promoting social communication programs with other religions and communities and contributing to the spread of religious principles of brotherhood. And Dr. Birgitte Scheppeland Johansen goes along the same line, talking about the importance of civil society and the role of civil society organizations. She says, as such, the very existence of an open and engaged civil society is an important antidote to extremism because it provides platforms for voicing injustices, for participating in meaningful activities, and for taking ownership of the society one lives in. If we are to effectively deal with extremism, we cannot just rely on the initiatives of the state. We will also have to look to the civil society. What is the specific contribution that comes from the civil society? Dr. Johansen says that civil society organizations have an important role because they do not represent the state, but they represent voluntary people, and they provide alternative activities to what the state can provide, and they can give people a platform and an alternative way to terrorism. Kirsten Auken and John Thompson gives excellent examples of how civil society organizations have set up programs that can counter terrorism. I'll conclude by referring to 3 rules set up by Dr. Al-Kasnavi. And I think they are set up on the basis of Islam, but they're also relevant for us from a Christian perspective. First of all, he says we need to take a comprehensive approach. We cannot say, as the secularists do, that it is only a problem about the Islamic religion and their texts. We cannot say, as we tend to do from a religious point of view, that it is society and its injustices that create terrorism. We need to agree on a comprehensive approach. Secondly, we should address our religious culture, and there are elements in that religious culture, and I would say both on a Christian and Muslim side, that can create the basis for extremism. Thirdly, he also points to the need to be very careful about our interpretation and not just repeating interpretations from another context. Yesterday we listened to 12 presentations, and today there's time for digesting all what we've heard and for reflecting, and we'll do that in groups, and there are 3 topics First, we'll discuss the development and counting of extremism. Secondly, we'll discuss religion as cause and solution to the problem of extremism. And thirdly, we will discuss the role of civil society in preventing and confronting extremism. Thank you.